you its story. I still remember the first time I realized that wildlife videography was going to become more than a profession for me. I was standing on the edge of a vast open plain, and there was nothing extraordinary happening. No chase, no dramatic confrontation, just a warm breeze moving across the grass. Then, far in the distance, I noticed a group of giraffes moving slowly between the trees. They looked almost unreal against the horizon, their long necks rising above everything around them, their shadows stretching across the ground as the afternoon light began to fade. I raised my camera, but after a few seconds I stopped recording. I wanted to remember what I was seeing without looking through a lens. That became a habit for me. Whenever something truly beautiful happened, I would sometimes forget the camera completely. I've always been fascinated by the way animals can make an enormous landscape feel alive. A few zebras crossing an open field can change the entire atmosphere. A group of flamingos gathering around shallow water can turn an ordinary wetland into something that looks like a painting. Even a small family of meerkats standing together and watching their surroundings can make you stop and wonder what they're thinking. The longer I worked in the wild, the more I realized that every environment has its own personality. The grasslands feel open and unpredictable. The rainforest feels crowded with life. Mountain regions feel quiet and enormous. Wetlands seem almost endless. And the coast has its own rhythm, especially when the tide begins to change. I've filmed in places where the air was so humid that my equipment would become difficult to handle. I've worked in freezing mornings when my fingers barely wanted to move. I've stood in heavy rain waiting for the weather to clear. And I've spent afternoons sitting completely still because the slightest movement could disturb the scene I was trying to capture. One of the most interesting experiences I ever had was with a group of gorillas. There was something deeply human about the way they interacted with one another. The younger ones were curious and energetic. The adults were much calmer. They seemed to communicate constantly through gestures, expressions, movement, and sound. I didn't need to understand every signal to appreciate what was happening. You could simply watch them for a while and begin to understand that their world was built around relationships. That experience changed the way I think about intelligence in animals. We often measure intelligence by comparing animals with ourselves. But perhaps that's the wrong way to look at it. Maybe intelligence has many different forms. A bird finding its way across enormous distances. A whale navigating the ocean. An octopus solving a problem. A wolf coordinating with its pack. A bee returning to a distant colony. There are countless examples of animals understanding their surroundings in ways we are still learning about. And that's one reason I never get bored. There is always something I don't know. I once spent several days around a group of rhinos. At first glance, they can look incredibly intimidating. Their size alone demands respect. But when you spend time observing them, you start noticing details that aren't obvious from a quick encounter. The way they move through vegetation, the way they react to unfamiliar sounds, the way younger animals stay close to adults. Those small details are what I look for now. Early in my career, I wanted the biggest moment. Now I want the smallest detail that tells a bigger story. A single footprint in wet ground can tell you that an animal passed through recently. Broken branches can reveal movement. Marks on a tree can tell you that something has been using the area. The landscape itself becomes a kind of diary. You just have to learn how to read it. I've also learned that weather can completely transform wildlife photography. A clear morning gives you one world. Then clouds arrive, the light disappears, and suddenly everything feels dramatic. Sometimes the best footage I've captured came immediately after a storm. The ground is wet. Leaves are shining. Water is running through places that were dry an hour earlier. Animals begin moving again. Birds return to open areas, and the entire landscape seems refreshed. There was one afternoon when I watched a herd of wild horses moving through a field just after heavy rain. Their coats were wet. Mist was still hanging over the distant hills. The sunlight came through the clouds for only a few minutes. I barely had time to adjust my camera. Those few minutes became one of my favorite sequences. Not because anything spectacular happened, because everything simply looked right. That's what people sometimes misunderstand about wildlife films. The most memorable scene isn't always the most dangerous one. Sometimes it is the atmosphere, the sound of wind, the changing light, an animal moving naturally through its surroundings. A landscape that makes you forget where you are for a moment. I've always tried to capture that feeling. Of course, I've also had moments when the wild reminded me very quickly that I was not in control. I remember filming near a group of hippos once. From a distance, they can look almost peaceful, but their behavior demands a lot of caution. That day, I kept my distance and watched them from a secure position. They moved in and out of the water, occasionally disappearing beneath the surface. I realized how different an animal can look depending on its environment. On land, a hippo seems unbelievably heavy. In water, it moves with surprising ease. That contrast is one of the things I love about nature. There are always contradictions. The smallest creatures can survive in extreme conditions. The largest animals can move with incredible gentleness. Something that looks fragile can be incredibly resilient. Something that looks powerful can be extremely vulnerable. I've seen that same contrast with cheetahs. Their speed is famous, but what fascinates me is what happens before the movement. The stillness, the concentration, the careful positioning. For a brief moment, everything seems completely calm. Then the animal moves, and suddenly the entire landscape feels different. Those moments taught me another lesson about filming. Don't only record the action, record what comes before it. The anticipation can be just as powerful. I've carried that idea into almost every project since then. If I see birds gathering in the distance, I don't immediately start searching for the most dramatic angle. I wait. If I notice animals becoming alert, I pay attention to what changed. If the landscape suddenly becomes quiet, I don't assume nothing is happening. Often, the environment is telling you something. You just have to notice. I've had some beautiful encounters with birds as well. There was a wetland where thousands of them would gather during certain seasons. Watching them move together was incredible. One bird taking off could become dozens. Dozens could become hundreds. And suddenly the sky itself seemed to move. I could spend an entire afternoon filming that. No dialogue, no music, just wings, water, wind, and distant calls. Sometimes natural sound is enough. I've also learned to appreciate animals that people don't always consider glamorous. Hyenas, vultures, wild boars, insects, bats, and countless smaller creatures are all part of the same world. Without them, ecosystems would change dramatically. A vulture cleaning what remains after another animal's meal may not be the kind of image people put on a postcard, but it is an important part of nature. A beetle moving through the soil may look insignificant, but the ground beneath our feet depends on countless tiny organisms. The wild doesn't operate according to our idea of beauty. Everything has a purpose, and once you understand that, you begin seeing the environment differently. I remember filming a colony of ants one morning. It wasn't part of the assignment. I had arrived early and was waiting for larger animals to appear. While I was waiting, I noticed how organized the colony seemed. Thousands of tiny movements were happening around me. Workers carrying material, others following trails, different groups moving in different directions. I stayed there much longer than I expected. That morning never made it into the final film, but it reminded me that curiosity is one of the most valuable tools a filmmaker can have. You never know what will capture your attention. Sometimes the best story is the one you weren't planning to tell. I've had similar experiences in the mountains. At high elevations, the world feels completely different. The air is thinner. The vegetation changes. Clouds can move incredibly quickly, and animals that live there seem perfectly adapted to conditions that would be difficult for us. Mountain goats moving across steep rock faces always amazed me. They make surfaces that look impossible seem completely ordinary. I've watched them climb higher and higher until they became tiny shapes against the cliffs. Moments like that make you realize how much of the natural world remains beyond our everyday experience. There are places on this planet that most people will never visit. There are animals that most people will never see in person. There are behaviors that may happen only once in an entire season. That is why I take my work seriously. I know I am not simply collecting pretty pictures. I'm preserving moments that may disappear before most people ever have a chance to witness them. And every journey changes me in some small way. Sometimes I return with hundreds of hours of footage. Sometimes I return with only a few usable minutes. But I always return with something. A new memory, a new sound, a new lesson, a new place that I want to understand better. I've stopped measuring a successful expedition by how much footage I bring home. For me, success is coming back knowing I paid attention. Maybe I noticed an unusual behavior. Maybe I found a landscape I'd never seen before. Maybe I spent an hour watching something completely unexpected. That's enough, because the older I get, the more I appreciate experiences that cannot be repeated. The wild doesn't perform for cameras. It doesn't wait for perfect lighting. It doesn't care whether your battery is charged. It doesn't care if your lens is clean. A moment happens and then it is gone. That's what makes it valuable. And perhaps that's the greatest thing wildlife has given me. It taught me to appreciate the moment while it is happening. Not later, not after editing, not when the footage is uploaded. Right there, standing in the middle of an enormous world, surrounded by creatures following lives completely different from mine. I used to think I was going into the wilderness to tell stories about animals. Now I think the animals were teaching me how to tell stories about life itself, about patience, about adaptation, about family, about survival, about change, about finding a place in a world much bigger than ourselves. And after everything I've seen, I still feel like I've only scratched the surface. There are forests I haven't entered, mountains I haven't climbed, coastlines I haven't explored, and countless creatures I've never had the chance to film. That's what keeps me moving. Not the promise of finding something famous, not the promise of getting the perfect shot, just the possibility that somewhere ahead, completely beyond my expectations, there is another moment waiting. And when I finally discover it, I'll be there with my camera. But before I press record, I'll take a second to simply look, because sometimes the memory you carry in your mind is more important than the image you capture. And after all these years, that's the part of the wilderness I understand best. The camera records the moment, but the experience belongs to you. One of the things I never expected when I started filming wildlife was how much the environment itself would become part of my story. I used to think the animal was always the main subject. Now, when I look through my camera, I notice everything around it. The color of the sky, the shape of the trees, the movement of water, the way sunlight touches the ground. Even the smallest details can change the feeling of an entire scene. I remember spending several days along a coastline where the landscape seemed completely different from the forests and grasslands I was used to. There were enormous waves rolling toward the shore, seabirds moving with the wind, and seals resting on distant rocks. I had gone there expecting to film marine animals, but I became fascinated by the relationship between the animals and the ocean. The sea never really seems still. Even when the surface looks calm, something is always happening beneath it. I once spent an entire morning following a pod of dolphins from a distance. They would disappear beneath the surface and then suddenly reappear somewhere else. Sometimes they traveled together. Sometimes they spread out. And every time I thought I understood their pattern, they changed direction. Trying to film them taught me something completely different about timing. On land, you can often predict where an animal might move. In the ocean, you have to accept that you are working with a world that moves in every direction. The water controls the rhythm. The wind changes the surface. The light keeps shifting. And the animals are free to disappear whenever they want. That uncertainty made those recordings even more valuable to me. I remember one particular morning when the water was almost silver beneath the early sunlight. A whale surfaced far away from the boat. I barely had enough time to react. The camera was already in my hands, but the distance was enormous. The animal disappeared again before I could properly frame it. A few minutes later, it surfaced somewhere completely different. I never got the perfect shot that day, but I remember that whale much more clearly than some of the footage I captured perfectly. That's something wildlife has taught me repeatedly. A technically perfect image doesn't always become a great memory. Sometimes a blurry frame can carry more emotion because you remember what happened around it. I began thinking about that whenever I traveled into colder regions. The first time I worked around snow-covered landscapes, I was surprised by how quiet everything felt. Snow absorbs so much sound that even your own movements seem distant. I remember watching a polar bear moving across the white landscape. There was nothing familiar around me. No dense vegetation, no warm colors, just enormous stretches of snow and ice. The animal seemed perfectly suited to that environment. Its entire body, movement, and behavior made sense in a place where survival depends on adaptation. That word became important to me over the years. Adaptation. Everywhere I traveled, I saw different versions of it. Animals living in freezing temperatures. Animals surviving in extreme heat. Creatures spending their lives in darkness. Birds crossing enormous distances. Species that can survive with very little water. Nature doesn't create one solution for everything. It creates countless solutions. I've always been fascinated by deserts for that reason. People sometimes imagine a desert as an empty place. But spend enough time there and you'll realize that it's anything but empty. There are reptiles moving beneath the sand. Birds crossing the sky. Small mammals appearing for only a few minutes. Insects leaving tiny tracks across the ground. And plants that have learned to survive conditions that seem impossible. I once spent a long afternoon waiting near a desert watering area. The heat was intense. The landscape looked almost motionless. Then, as the temperature began to drop, life slowly appeared. A bird arrived first, then another. Small animals began moving through the shadows. It felt as if someone had switched the world back on. That experience changed the way I think about time in nature. Sometimes nothing happens because the conditions aren't right. Then suddenly, everything happens at once. I've experienced the same thing during nighttime shoots. The forest after dark is an entirely different world. During the day, you can see movement everywhere. At night, your eyes become almost useless. You begin depending on sound. A rustle in the leaves, a distant call, wings moving overhead. something stepping through vegetation. You don't always know what made the sound. And honestly, that's part of the excitement. I remember one night when I was filming nocturnal wildlife and heard something moving through the vegetation nearby. I couldn't see it. I waited. The sound stopped. Then it started again from another direction. Moments like that make you realize how much animals can experience that we never notice. Their senses are designed for environments that would be incredibly difficult for us to navigate. Some can see in extremely low light. Some can detect sounds we cannot hear. Some can smell things from extraordinary distances. The more I learned, the more I realized how limited our own perception can be. I've also spent time filming bats emerging from caves. Watching thousands of them leave at once is something I will never forget. At first, you see a few, then more appear. Then suddenly the entire entrance seems to be moving. They fill the air and disappear into the darkness. It's chaotic from our perspective, but there is an incredible organization to it. The same feeling came back to me when I watched huge flocks of birds moving across the sky. One bird turns, then another follows. Within seconds, the entire group changes direction. There is no visible leader telling them what to do. Yet somehow the movement works. I could watch those formations for hours. The sky becomes almost like another landscape. And sometimes the most beautiful wildlife scenes don't involve a single animal. They involve hundreds, thousands, entire groups moving together. I've filmed penguins packed together in freezing conditions, and what surprised me was how much activity was happening within what initially looked like a motionless crowd. Individuals constantly moved. Groups separated and reunited. Some searched for space. Others stayed close together. The more you observe, the more you notice that even a huge colony has its own small stories. That became one of my favorite ways to film. Instead of always searching for the biggest subject, I started looking for individual moments inside a larger scene. One animal doing something different. One bird leaving the group. One young animal following an adult. One creature reacting to something outside the frame. Those little details can make a huge environment feel personal. I've noticed the same thing with primates. A large group can look chaotic from a distance, but when you spend time watching them, you begin to notice relationships. Who stays close to whom? Who seems curious? Who is protective? Who is exploring? Who is resting? Their behavior can be surprisingly expressive. I remember sitting quietly near a troop of monkeys for a long time without trying to interfere. Eventually, they stopped paying attention to me. That was when the real filming began. They went back to behaving naturally. Young ones started playing. Adults moved through the branches. Some searched for food while others simply watched their surroundings. I didn't need dramatic action. The everyday behavior was enough. That's something I wish more people understood about wildlife. The ordinary moments can be extraordinary when you actually take the time to watch them. I filmed animals eating, sleeping, walking, swimming, climbing, playing, grooming, and simply standing around. Those moments might sound simple, but together they tell us how an animal lives. And understanding how an animal lives is much more interesting to me than simply seeing it. Sometimes I spend hours studying an animal before I even think about filming it. I want to understand its environment. I want to know what kind of behavior is normal. I want to know what might make it uncomfortable. Because the camera should never become more important than the animal. That rule has stayed with me throughout my work. There have been moments when I could have moved closer for a better shot. I didn't. There have been times when I could have followed an animal longer. I stopped. There have been situations where the light was perfect but the animal needed space. The camera went down. I never regretted those decisions. The wild doesn't need us to interfere with it. It needs us to understand it. And sometimes the best way to understand something is to leave it alone. I've met researchers during my travels who spend years studying a single species. That kind of dedication always impressed me. A filmmaker might spend days looking for a particular behavior. A scientist might spend years trying to understand it. Both perspectives are valuable. One helps people feel connected to wildlife. The other helps us understand what we're seeing. I've learned something from both. The more knowledge I gain, the more curious I become. There are still behaviors I can't explain. There are still species I barely know anything about. There are still places where I could spend an entire lifetime and never see everything. And that feeling of curiosity is probably what keeps me moving. I don't want to reach a point where I believe I've seen it all. I don't think that's possible anyway. The natural world keeps changing. Seasons change. Habitats change. Animals change their behavior. Migration patterns shift. Weather can transform an entire landscape. Even a familiar location can surprise you after a few months. I once returned to a place I'd filmed several years earlier and barely recognized it. The vegetation had changed. The river was at a different level. Different birds were present. The landscape had its own new rhythm. Standing there with my camera, I realized that I wasn't returning to the same place. I was returning to a new version of it.